Is it wrong to eat your pet dog? In some cultures, it's completely normal. In others, it's a horrifying thought that would make most people physically ill. But here's the real mind-bender. Both groups are equally convinced they're right. Welcome to the fascinating world of ethical relativism, the idea that moral truths aren't universal constants like gravity or the speed of light, but rather products of our cultural conditioning and individual beliefs. According to research published in the Journal of Cultural Psychology, even basic moral values that we might assume are universal, like harming others is wrong, are interpreted radically differently across cultures. The same action that's seen as cruel in an individualistic society might be viewed as necessary for group harmony in a collectivist one. This isn't just an academic debate. In our increasingly connected world, these clashing moral frameworks create real conflicts that affect billions of lives. From international human rights standards to cultural practices that some view as sacred and others see as horrific, ethical relativism forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions about right and wrong. Today, we're diving into 7 mind-bending examples that will challenge everything you believe about morality. These aren't just thought experiments. They're real situations that have forced societies to confront the complexity of human ethics. You'll see how different cultures have justified practices that others consider unthinkable, and how moral frameworks that seem obvious to us might look completely foreign to others. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the simple question, "What is right?" turns out to be one of humanity's most complex and contentious debates. Get ready to have your assumptions challenged. This is Outlier Thinking, and we're about to explore the fascinating world of ethical relativism. Let's start with a practice that modern society universally condemns, but was once considered the height of moral behavior: the systematic hardening of children through extreme physical and psychological challenges. In ancient Sparta, children as young as 7 were removed from their families and placed in the agoge, a rigorous military training system designed to create the perfect warriors. Parents who protested this separation were considered weak and unpatriotic. The Spartans genuinely believed this system was moral and necessary. It created strong defenders for their society and instilled values they held sacred: courage, resilience, and absolute loyalty to the state. The brutality of this training would shock modern sensibilities. Many boys died during the brutal training regime. Those who survived faced regular beatings, were deliberately underfed to encourage stealing, teaching resourcefulness, and were forced to compete in violent contests. Perhaps most disturbing to modern eyes, the deaths of weaker children were seen as a positive outcome, a way of strengthening the gene pool. Now, contrast this with modern Western societies. In the past century, we've seen a complete reversal in how we view child welfare. The implementation of child protection laws has corresponded with dramatic improvements in child welfare. According to UNICEF data, the global under 5 mortality rate declined by 58% from 1990 to 2017. In OECD countries, the average infant mortality rate was just 4.2 deaths per 1,000 live births in 2019. Modern parents who subjected their children to even a fraction of what Spartan children endured would face criminal charges. We view childhood as a time for nurturing, education, and emotional development. Research shows children raised in nurturing environments develop better social skills, emotional well-being, and academic success. They're more resilient and better equipped to handle stress and adversity. The fascinating part? Both societies were equally convinced their approach was morally correct. The Spartans would likely view our soft approach to child rearing as deeply immoral, creating weak citizens unable to defend their society. Meanwhile, we see their methods as brutal child abuse. This stark contrast reveals something profound about moral relativism. Even our most basic intuitions about protecting children, something that feels like it should be a universal moral truth, are shaped by cultural context and historical circumstances. The Spartans weren't evil. They simply operated under a completely different moral framework that prioritized military excellence and societal survival over individual welfare. This example forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. How many of our own obvious moral truths might future societies view with the same horror with which we view Spartan practices? What current parenting practices might our descendants consider barbaric? Let's talk about marriage, something most people think they understand until they learn how incredibly varied it can be across cultures. What we consider normal marriage today is just one of many systems that different societies have viewed as morally correct. Here's a surprising statistic. Monogamy, which many consider the only moral form of marriage, is actually relatively rare when we look at human history. According to the Ethnographic Atlas, out of 1,231 societies studied, only 186 were strictly monogamous. But it gets more interesting. Take polygamy. While only about 2% of the global population lives in polygamous households today, it's legal and practiced in several regions, particularly in West and Central Africa. In countries like Burkina Faso, 36% of people live in polygamous households. Even more fascinating is polyandry, where women marry multiple men. While extremely rare globally, it's still practiced in some regions, like the Tibetan Plateau. In these societies, this arrangement isn't viewed as immoral, but as a practical and ethical solution to specific economic and environmental challenges. Let's talk about arranged marriages, a practice many Westerners view as morally questionable. Yet the data tells an interesting story. Arranged marriages have significantly lower divorce rates than love marriages. The global divorce rate for arranged marriages is approximately 4%, compared to 55% for love marriages. What makes this diversity in marriage systems particularly revealing is how they're shaped by economic conditions. In societies with scarce resources, polygamy often emerges as a way to ensure economic stability. Where land is limited and labor-intensive, like in certain Himalayan regions, polyandry becomes a solution for keeping family lands intact. This reveals something profound about moral rules. They often arise not from universal truths, but from practical circumstances. Each marriage system emerged as a solution to specific social and economic challenges, and over time, these practical solutions became moral imperatives. The marriage paradox forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. What we consider obviously moral relationship structures are largely products of our cultural and economic environment. A practice that seems unethical to us might be the foundation of social stability in another society. Think about that the next time you hear someone claim there's only one right way to structure relationships. The global diversity of marriage systems suggests that human beings are remarkably adaptable in how they organize their most intimate relationships, and that morality often follows practicality rather than the other way around. Few practices challenge our moral assumptions more profoundly than ritual cannibalism, an act that most modern societies consider the ultimate taboo, but which some cultures viewed as deeply sacred and morally necessary. Consider the 4 people of Papua New Guinea who practiced funerary cannibalism as a way to honor their dead. This wasn't done out of cruelty or barbarism, quite the opposite. They believed that consuming the deceased showed the deepest form of love and respect, preventing their bodies from rotting or being eaten by worms. The Aztecs provide another fascinating example. They practiced sacrificial cannibalism, consuming the flesh of victims after human sacrifices to their gods. In their worldview, this wasn't an act of violence, but a profoundly sacred ritual necessary for the continuation of the universe itself. The corpses were considered holy, and the act of consumption was embedded in complex religious beliefs about maintaining cosmic order. This forces us to confront a challenging question. How do we reconcile these deeply spiritual practices with our own absolute moral prohibitions? The participants in these rituals weren't acting out of cruelty or immorality. They were following what they genuinely believed to be sacred moral imperatives. Even in European history, we find surprising examples that challenge our assumptions. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, human tissue was consumed as medicine in Europe and China. What we today consider cannibalism was viewed as a legitimate medical practice, showing how context can transform even our most rigid moral boundaries. The modern rejection of cannibalism reveals something fascinating about moral evolution. Contemporary indigenous peoples who historically practiced cannibalism now view these traditions through a complex lens, acknowledging their cultural significance while recognizing why they've been abandoned. This isn't simply about rejecting old practices, but understanding how moral frameworks evolve with changing circumstances and knowledge. This example perfectly illustrates how religious and cultural context shapes our deepest moral instincts. What one society views as a sacred obligation, another sees as the ultimate transgression. Neither perspective is inherently right or wrong. They're products of different cultural and religious frameworks that provide meaning and moral structure to their practitioners. The Cannibalism Dilemma reminds us that even our strongest moral reactions, the ones that feel most natural and obvious, are often shaped by cultural conditioning rather than universal truth. This doesn't mean we should abandon our moral convictions, but it should make us pause before assuming our moral intuitions are universal or absolute. Let's confront one of the most challenging moral issues in our modern world: honor killings. This practice presents a stark example of how cultural relativism collides with claims of universal human rights. According to United Nations estimates, approximately 5,000 women and girls are murdered each year in so-called honor killings by members of their families. However, many experts believe the actual number could be significantly higher, potentially up to 20,000 annually, due to widespread underreporting. What makes this practice particularly complex, from an ethical perspective, is how differently it's viewed across cultures. In some societies, honor killings are seen not as murders, but as necessary acts to preserve family honor and social order. The perpetrators often genuinely believe they're fulfilling a moral obligation. This creates a profound challenge for international human rights standards. Take Pakistan's legal system as an example. Despite passing the anti-honor crime bill with minimum sentences of 25 years to life imprisonment, honor killings continue to occur. Why? Because local cultural beliefs often override legal frameworks. Even when laws exist on paper, cultural acceptance of these practices can make them nearly impossible to enforce. The controversy becomes even more complex when we look at how different countries approach this issue legally. Jordan, for example, maintained laws until 2017 that provided reduced penalties for honor crimes. Iran's legal system still includes provisions that can exempt husbands from punishment for killing wives caught in adultery. But here's where ethical relativism meets its limits. Can we accept the argument that honor killings are moral within certain cultural contexts? Or are there some practices that violate universal human rights regardless of cultural justifications? International human rights organizations have taken a clear stance. Honor killings violate fundamental human rights, regardless of cultural context. Yet implementing this universal standard runs into practical challenges. How do we respect cultural sovereignty while protecting individual rights? When does cultural relativism cross the line into moral abdication? The evolution of attitudes toward honor killings over the past 50 years offers some hope. Many traditional societies have seen significant shifts in how these practices are viewed, driven by a combination of legal reforms, increased awareness about human rights, and changing cultural norms. This example forces us to confront the limits of ethical relativism. While understanding and respecting cultural differences is important, there may be certain universal moral standards that transcend cultural boundaries. The honor-killing controversy reminds us that navigating between cultural relativism and universal moral standards isn't just an academic exercise. It's a challenge that affects real lives every day. It pushes us to ask, how do we balance respect for cultural differences with the protection of fundamental human rights? Few moral issues better illustrate how shared values can lead to opposing conclusions than euthanasia. What's more remarkable, both sides of this debate often claim to be protecting the same thing: human dignity. Consider the Netherlands, where euthanasia has been legal since 2001. In this society, the ability to choose when and how to die is seen as a fundamental human right, an expression of personal autonomy and dignity. Dutch physicians regularly participate in euthanasia procedures, with general practitioners performing 85% of all cases. Now contrast this with countries where euthanasia remains strictly forbidden. In the Philippines, doctors assisting a patient to die can be imprisoned and charged with malpractice. In Turkey, anyone assisting in suicide can face life imprisonment. These societies view protecting life, even painful life, as a sacred moral obligation. What makes this debate particularly fascinating is how economic and social factors influence these moral positions. For instance, in countries with advanced healthcare systems and high costs of end-of-life care, the moral argument for euthanasia often gains more traction. Meanwhile, in societies with strong religious influences or different healthcare traditions, the sanctity of life typically takes precedence over personal autonomy. The reasons given for euthanasia requests reveal how deeply personal these moral decisions are. Loss of autonomy, decreasing ability to participate in activities that make life enjoyable, and loss of dignity are among the most common reasons cited. In Oregon, for example, 89.5% of euthanasia requests cite loss of autonomy as a primary concern. But here's where it gets even more complex. Both sides of this debate can point to potential abuses to support their position. Advocates for euthanasia argue that forcing people to suffer against their will is a form of cruelty. Opponents worry about vulnerable people being pressured to end their lives prematurely. This reveals something profound about moral reasoning. Even when different cultures share the same fundamental values, in this case, human dignity and the reduction of suffering, they can reach radically different conclusions about what's moral. The Dutch view, allowing a suffering person to die, as protecting their dignity. Others see it as an abdication of society's moral duty to protect life. What makes the euthanasia debate particularly relevant to ethical relativism is how it shows that moral disagreements aren't always about different values. Sometimes they're about different interpretations of the same values. Both sides want to protect human dignity. Both sides want to reduce suffering. Both sides believe they're taking the moral position. This forces us to confront a challenging question. If two societies can share the same fundamental values, yet reach opposing moral conclusions, what does this tell us about the nature of moral truth? Perhaps the answer isn't in declaring one side right and the other wrong, but in understanding how different cultural contexts can lead to equally sincere but opposing moral frameworks. Imagine a society where disturbing a tomb was considered more morally reprehensible than taking a life. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where grave robbing wasn't just a crime, it was considered one of the most heinous moral transgressions possible. The punishment for grave robbing in ancient Egypt was brutal and final, usually death, especially if the tomb belonged to royalty. If the mummy was left untouched, the merciful alternative might be mere amputation of the hands. Compare this to other serious crimes of the time, where monetary fines or physical punishment might suffice. But here's what makes this truly fascinating. This wasn't just about protecting property or maintaining social order. The ancient Egyptians believed that disturbing a tomb could have cosmic consequences. They held that everyone had a soul that split into two parts after death. The Ba, which watched over the living family, and the Ka, which enjoyed life in the land of two fields. If something happened to the tomb, such as damage to the mummy or loss of the nameplate, the Ba and Ka would get lost, and the individual would be lost forever, a fate worse than death itself. This worldview created a profound moral framework where protecting the eternal journey of the soul took precedence over protecting mortal life. Think about that for a moment. In our modern society, we generally consider murder the ultimate crime because it ends a life. But in ancient Egyptian society, grave robbing was considered worse because it could end an eternal existence. The depth of this belief is evident in how they protected their tombs. They didn't just rely on physical security. They carved curses on doors, created elaborate false passages, and developed complex architectural features to protect the deceased's eternal journey. The Egyptians weren't just protecting bodies or treasures. They were guarding the gateway between this world and the next. This example reveals something profound about how moral hierarchies are constructed. Our modern society, largely shaped by secular and humanist values, places the highest moral premium on protecting human life. But the ancient Egyptians, operating from a completely different religious and philosophical framework, had an entirely different moral calculus. What's particularly striking is that this wasn't a matter of the Egyptians being less morally developed. They had sophisticated legal systems and complex ethical codes. Rather, their different underlying assumptions about the nature of existence led them to completely different conclusions about what constituted the greatest moral harm. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. How much of our own moral hierarchy is based on fundamental truths, and how much is shaped by our underlying assumptions about the nature of existence? If we believed, as the ancient Egyptians did, that disturbing a tomb could eternally destroy a soul, might we too consider it worse than murder? The ancient Egyptian paradox reminds us that moral hierarchies don't exist in a vacuum. They're built on foundational beliefs about the nature of reality, consciousness, and existence itself. Change those foundational beliefs, and the entire moral structure shifts with them. War represents perhaps the ultimate challenge to moral absolutism, revealing how actions condemned as atrocities by one side can be celebrated as heroic by another. No other human activity so starkly illustrates how context can completely invert moral values. Let's start with a sobering fact. Since World War II, thousands of war crimes trials have been conducted globally. The Nuremberg trials alone tried 199 defendants, with 161 convictions and 37 death sentences. Yet here's the fascinating part. Out of all convicted war criminals who have expressed their views, only 19% acknowledged personal responsibility and expressed genuine remorse. The majority either justified their actions or expressed only general regret for the suffering of victims without accepting personal responsibility. Why? Because in many cases, these individuals genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They operated within moral frameworks shaped by nationalism, ideology, and circumstance that made their actions not just acceptable, but righteous. Take the Vietnam War. In US textbooks, it's typically portrayed as a conflict to contain communism, with a focus on American strategic interests. In Vietnamese textbooks, it's called the American War, and is presented as a patriotic struggle for national liberation against a brutal oppressor. Or consider the Dunkirk evacuation in World War II. British textbooks present it as a triumphant example of national resilience and bravery. German textbooks initially described it as a major German victory. The same military operation is cast in entirely different moral lights depending on which side is telling the story. This pattern repeats throughout history. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the decolonization of India, the invasion of Poland, each of these events is taught differently in different countries' textbooks, with radically different moral implications. What makes this particularly challenging for ethical absolutism is that these aren't simply cases of one side lying and the other telling the truth. Rather, they represent fundamentally different moral frameworks, each internally consistent within its own context. This reveals something profound about moral reasoning. In times of extreme conflict, moral frameworks don't just bend, they can completely invert. Actions that would be considered horrific crimes in peacetime become acts of valor in war. Perhaps most troubling is how nationalism affects moral judgment. The same action performed by our side versus their side is often judged by entirely different moral standards. This isn't just hypocrisy, it's a fundamental feature of how human beings process moral questions in conditions of conflict. The moral relativism of war forces us to confront the possibility that even our strongest moral convictions might look very different from another perspective. If actions as extreme as war crimes can be viewed so differently depending on context, what does this tell us about the nature of moral truth itself. This doesn't mean we should abandon moral judgment entirely. After all, international laws and human rights standards exist precisely because we recognize the need for universal moral principles. But it does suggest that moral certainty, especially in conditions of conflict, should be approached with profound humility and self-awareness. As we've seen through these 7 examples, the relationship between culture and morality is far more complex than most people realize. From ancient Sparta to modern euthanasia debates, what seems obviously moral in one context can appear deeply unethical in another. But this doesn't mean we should throw up our hands and declare all morality purely relative. Instead, these examples should push us to think more deeply about the foundations of our own moral beliefs and how we judge the practices of others. First, if you had been born and raised in a completely different culture, say ancient Sparta or modern Papua New Guinea, would you still hold the same moral beliefs you do now? Really think about how your current moral framework has been shaped by your cultural context. Second, how can we make ethical judgments about other cultures' practices while acknowledging the reality of moral relativism? Is there a way to balance cultural respect with universal human rights? Third, can you identify any moral belief you hold that you think would be truly universal across all cultures and all of human history? Be careful. As we've seen, even seemingly obvious moral truths like protect children or don't kill can have radically different interpretations in different contexts. Finally, consider this challenging question. What moral beliefs or practices in your own culture might future generations look back on with horror? Just as we now condemn practices that past societies considered perfectly moral, what current practices might our descendants view as barbaric? These aren't just theoretical questions. In our increasingly interconnected world, understanding how and why moral frameworks differ across cultures isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's essential for navigating complex global challenges and building a more ethically nuanced world. The next time you find yourself making an absolute moral judgment, pause and consider how much of what you consider obviously right or wrong is actually shaped by your cultural context. The answer might surprise you.